Hi everybody, Joe here from Shutter Speak Photography. Very nice to see your smiling faces again here on YouTube. So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about HDR photography. Now, HDR photography has very much been a long-standing favorite of mine. I love going out doing landscape photography, taking landscapes. It's just peaceful. You're in a beautiful location. And then you get to come back with images and do some creative editing, and it's just a really pleasant experience. It's one that I've always enjoyed, and the landscape's never complained about the work that you've done. So there's always that, right? So that being said, why use HDR photography at all? And quite frankly, with the Nikon Z series cameras, the RAW files are so good. The question has become, do we need HDR anymore? Well, I think the answer to that is kind of yes and kind of no, but I think there's always going to be some use case for HDR photography, maybe cityscapes at night especially, where you want a very, very clean image. But a typical landscape, sunset, where traditionally we always needed HDR photography, we really don't need anymore. And I'm going to show you a technique in Lightroom, and I'm going to edit out a photo for you, and then we're going to compare it against an HDR, and you're going to see the differences, and you can decide for yourself whether you think HDR is worth it or if HDR just really isn't necessary anymore. But I think that it's going to prove out to be pretty interesting. So first off, what is HDR photography? In case you don't know, the quick overview: HDR stands for high dynamic range, and we're talking about the differences in lights and darks in the image. So deep shadows, bright highlights. Think of a sunset where everything's going dark in the foreground, but the sun is offsetting in the distance and it's very bright. Okay, so that's an example of an image that would have high dynamic range. So how much dynamic range can the human eye see? So that's an important thing to know. The human eye can see between 10 to 14 EVs, exposures of light. Now, the Nikon Z series camera scores at about 12 EVs for landscape photography, so it's hitting right in the center. So pretty much it's hitting the dead center of what the average human eye can see. So right off the bat, we're already capturing almost everything that we need. So the question becomes, can HDR still do a better job, or can we edit out a single shot in Lightroom and get the same image quality that we're looking for, or maybe better, or maybe not better? Well, hey, let's take a look and see. But before we do, I'd just like to say thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. And if anything in this video helps you out, please help me out by hitting the subscribe button and ring the bell so you get notified of future updates to this channel. I'd appreciate that. And hey, let's take a look at some pictures. Okay, so we are here in Lightroom, and the first thing I want to mention about HDR photography that's important is it's important to shoot at the lowest ISO that you can. So these images were shot at ISO 64, which is the base or lowest ISO of the Nikon Z7. That's going to give us the cleanest images with the least amount of noise that we can possibly generate with camera. So we have our baseline exposure here. So now when you do HDR photography, typically what you do is you'll take a midline normally exposed image, and this is it here on the screen now. Then you'll take a two-stop underexposed and a two-stop overexposed, and I'll show you why in case you're not familiar with HDR. So this is our two-stop underexposed, and you'll see it really hasn't captured the rocks, but it's done a nice job capturing the water. It's got the sun without the sun being clipped at all, and it's got some nice color in the sky. So really, this two-stop underexposed is really just capturing the sun and the water and some of those nice colors in the sky. And now, this is a two-stop overexposed that's doing a great job at capturing the rocks here in the foreground, but of course we've lost the sun in the sky. And that's why we take these images and combine them using an HDR software like Aurora HDR, which is my personal favorite. So the question becomes, though, since we have a 0 EV file, a normally exposed file, with a whopping 12 EVs of dynamic range, can we bring this file to a point where it's just as good as the HDR would have been by blending the 3 files combined? So I'm going to step you through one of my favorite image editing techniques for landscape photography, and we'll see what we can pull out of this RAW file. So the procedure for this type of editing is simply just taking the highlights and dropping them way down, okay? Taking the shadows, bring them all the way up. You can bring the highlights all the way down, but we get a little bit of a halo around the sun there, so I'm gonna back it off a little bit just to give it a little extra. But it's really going to be personal preference there. And then we're going to take the whites, and then what we want to do is we want to really pay attention to the histogram. That's this area up here, the histogram, and it says histogram. And we're going to look at this little triangle box up here that says show shadow clipping. And we're going to look at this box here, show highlight clipping. So those boxes will illuminate when we start to clip various colors. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with the whites first, and we're going to start to move the whites to the right, and you'll see the histogram sliding to the right as well. And as soon as we start to hit colors that are now being clipped, so for example now yellow is being clipped, you see the boxes lit up yellow. But I'm mostly concerned with my whites. Okay? So if I do it slow enough, you'll see eventually the box does turn white right about there, so it's turned white. So I'm going to back up a little bit. Now, there's another way you can do this that's probably a better way. So what you can do is hold the Alt key down on your keyboard or Option on the Mac, and then slide this white slider. And what will happen is when you move the slider, you'll see exactly what you're losing. Okay, so you can see the colors being clipped. Okay. And if we move this all the way down, we actually could recover that sun completely there. That's the sun on the water. But in this case, with this image, we do have to lose a little bit for the sake of brightness to this image. So I'm going to say we'll keep it right about here. We don't want to start blooming, clipping various colors. So let's get it right to about there. And that looks pretty good. Now we're going to do the same thing with the blacks, but we're going to do it the opposite direction. So we're going to move the blacks to the left, and you'll see the histogram move to the left, and you'll see it lights up pretty quickly. So we don't have a lot of room to play with there, but we're not really losing much, and we're going to see that when we hold the Alt key down. We're going to see exactly what we lose. So we're really just losing a little bit of shadow right here in the corner right now. And of course, as we pull that down, we'll start to lose more and more and more until we've lost a ton of detail. But so what we're going to do is we're just going to bring this up a little bit. We're just losing the tiniest bit of detail, maybe right around here or so. That's not going to be very noticeable. Okay. Now at this point, we have a really solid exposure. The foreground looks great. The sun and the water look pretty good. And now, if you really wanted to give it that HDR look, you could start playing around with things like clarity that can really just pump up the detail. I don't necessarily recommend that. Maybe a little bit of clarity looks nice. You could dehaze a little bit, which is going to add in some blacks. I don't think that that's necessary here. And then the vibrance, of course, is going to either soften or add color to the image. And again, it doesn't need much because the tones are just so strong. And then, you can play around with your saturation a little bit. And I pretty much leave it right around there, I think. Now, it does look a little bit dark in the foreground compared to what you would get with an HDR, and we're definitely seeing some vignetting on the sides of this image, but overall it looks pretty good. If we wanted to raise this image up a little bit, I think what I would do is I would use one of these brand new, very fancy Lightroom masks, and I would select the sky, and we'll let Lightroom work its magic here, selecting the sky. And once it's done, boom, we have a perfect mask of the sky there. Amazing, beautiful. And what we'll do is we're going to invert this. Okay, so now we should be affecting only the ground, not the sky. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bump up the exposure a little bit here. And that looks pretty good. Okay, I think the mask actually might not be as, yeah, it is affecting a little bit of this area here, and we could, you know, we could subtract some of that out. We could brush it out right there. So we can brush that out of the mask to make sure that this area doesn't get affected by our changes. So let's take a look. We can brush it in maybe a little bit more. Okay, now let's take a look. Yeah, and that's pretty good. So, all right, so now we've just brightened up this area here, and then I might even go crazy and create yet another mask and select the sky again, but this time just work on the sky. And we can do this now in Lightroom because we have these incredibly effective features now for masking. So, all right, so now maybe let's see what we want to do a little bit with this. Now, I think by bringing the highlights down a little bit, yeah, we're going to get a little bit more color in the sky. We can play around with the contrast a little bit and see how that affects things. We're pulling in a lot of yellows there. And we can, you know, just tweak this a little bit to however you like it. I might pull the shadows a little bit just to soften the transition here. You know, we could adjust the saturation to your liking, and you know, again, we're just affecting the sky here. And so, you know, once you're happy with that, you know, hit done, and we have a really rock solid image here that really comes very close to what I think we're going to get if we blended these three images together and created an HDR. So let's give that a try now and let's see what happens. But first, I'm going to create a virtual copy of this. Okay, that way we can compare it later after we're done. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this image and I'm going to reset it. Okay, so all of my changes are now gone, and we're going to take this image here. Okay, we're going to take the -2, the +2, and we're going to combine them in Aurora HDR. Again, my all-time favorite HDR program. I love Aurora HDR. It's made by Skylum software. And I feel like it's probably the best out of all the HDR softwares that I've ever tried. The only downside that I have with the software is that Skylum has never updated the software since its newer version had come out, and I want to say that that's been about maybe 4 years or so now. So their claim is that the software is perfect and it doesn't need any updating, and quite honestly, I mean, that kind of does hold out to be true, but I mean, there are advances over the years, so things like noise reduction and things like that. I'm sure that there could be improvements to this program, but if you ask me what's the best HDR program out there, I'm still going to have to recommend Aurora HDR. You can see best Mac app of 2017, it says it right there, and I'm sure in 2017 that was true, and it might still be today. So I'm going to choose auto alignment just to make sure that all of our images are perfectly aligned when we do the blending. There are a few other things like remove chromatic aberration and ghost reduction, which I don't really think that we need to worry about. I mean, you can turn this on because there is some movement in the water, so it'll choose the 0, and you can pick that, of course. And then we just say create HDR and we'll let it roll. So we're going to let this combine, and then we'll come back in a couple of seconds and we'll take a look at the results. Okay, so Aurora HDR has finished its magic, and we can now go ahead and make any tweaks and changes we want. You can see here that, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of options here on the right side to adjust this image, and this is what I believe Aurora HDR's strength really comes from. We can create layers and et cetera, and then there's also templates that we can apply, and I'm just going to, for the sake of keeping this video short, I'm going to apply a template. I'm going to go with realistic landscape. Okay, it's made some basic changes, and you can adjust how much of this template you want it to use. And then from that point, I'm just going to apply it, and it'll bump the image back to Lightroom. So I'm going to let it build out this HDR now, export it, and then we'll take a look at it back in Lightroom. Okay, so here is the processed image from Aurora HDR, and it looks pretty close to the one that we worked on together, right? So hey, let's compare them side by side now in Lightroom. Okay, so on the left we have our Aurora HDR image. On the right, our Nikon RAW file that we processed. And I mean, if you look at the foreground here, I mean, they're extremely similar. Now, I do think that Aurora HDR, by blending those three files together, has created a better sky. But it's really personal preference at this point, only in so much as it's a little bit smoother in its transitions over here. You know, this is a lot more yellow. If you prefer the yellow, maybe you might actually like the Nikon RAW file better. Now, there may be other processing that we could still do with this RAW file. Maybe we could have processed the foreground and the sky separately, and maybe we would have gotten smoother transitions. We do have much more vignetting here than we do in the HDR image, and you may prefer the vignetting. You may want to add vignetting in to the other image, so that's kind of going to be also a personal preference. But I'm really impressed with don't mind that with the data that is contained in this RAW file. I mean, the amount of image data that we're able to recover and process is just absolutely spectacular. And if we zoom in here, and you can see even with the HDR blending three images together, there's no real loss in image quality with the blend. This image, the single Nikon RAW file, maybe is slightly sharper, but that could be because we added clarity to the RAW file. It's tough to say, but I mean, to me, really the only major difference here is going to be the blending of the sky. If you prefer these pinks and oranges to the yellows, and again, personal preference. So pretty impressive, I think. Let me know in the comments which one of these you prefer. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Do you prefer that smoother transition of the pink sky, or do you prefer the yellow? Do you think HDR is not even necessary anymore for a sunset, or do you think we still have a use case for it? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, but I am thoroughly impressed with the Nikon RAW file. All right, so that is some incredibly impressive dynamic range that came straight out of that Nikon Z7 RAW file. I mean, honestly, I'm impressed. I didn't know what the results were really going to be until I started playing around with this today and decided to show you what I had come up with by testing out the difference between just a straight up RAW file and blending these in Aurora. Now, again, I love the creative process of doing this either way. To me, it's just a lot of fun playing around with these images in the software and seeing what you can come up with. But hey, so I hope you liked this video. If you did, do me a favor, hit like, leave me a comment, and let me know which of those image files you preferred. Straight out of camera, edited in Lightroom, or the blended Aurora HDR image. Hit the subscribe button, leave me a comment. I do answer almost all of the comments that you guys leave me. I try my best. Not every single one, but probably 95% of them. So I'd love to hear from you. Let's connect. And also on Facebook, we have a Nikon Z Facebook users group, kind of new, just getting started. And we could use people who want to be a part of that. We need admins and moderators and things like that. So I'll leave a link in the video description below to that. Thanks for watching, YouTube. See you next time. Bye-bye.